For years, if you ask the average computer user why they didn't switch to Linux, the answer was almost automatic. It's too complicated. My apps won't work. Gaming is bad. Drivers are a nightmare. There's no support. Linux has always carried this strange reputation. Powerful, secure, customizable, but somehow not ready for normal people. And yet here we are in 2026, and something feels different. The conversations have changed. The excuses sound outdated. The complaints don't hit the same way they used to. So the big question is this: has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness, or are we just witnessing another cycle of hype? To understand what's happening in 2026, we have to go back to what Linux's biggest weakness actually was. It wasn't performance, it wasn't security, it wasn't stability. In fact, in those areas, Linux often outperformed Windows and Mac. The real weakness was usability friction. Not just usability in the interface sense, but the entire experience around it, installing it. Finding compatible hardware, running popular applications, troubleshooting obscure errors, dealing with fragmentation. For years, Linux didn't fail because it was bad. It failed because it demanded effort. And in the consumer world, effort is everything. Think about Windows. You buy a laptop, turn it on, and everything mostly works. Your Wi-Fi connects, your graphics drivers are installed, your printer probably shows up, Microsoft Office is a download away, Adobe apps work, your games launch. The experience isn't perfect, but it's predictable. Linux historically required intention. You had to choose a distro, then choose a desktop environment, then hope your hardware was supported. If your NVIDIA driver broke after an update, you were on your own. If your Wi-Fi chipset was obscure, you might be compiling something from GitHub at midnight. But 2026 Linux doesn't feel like that anymore. Not entirely. Something has shifted beneath the surface. And that shift is subtle but powerful. It's not just about prettier interfaces. It's about infrastructure. Flatpak and Snap have matured. App images have stabilized. Proton has become shockingly reliable. Hardware vendors have slowly, quietly improved support. Even OEM partnerships have expanded. For the first time, Linux doesn't feel like an experiment. It feels like an option. Gaming used to be the loudest argument against Linux. It can't run my games. That sentence alone kept millions away. But with Proton's evolution and Steam's aggressive investment in Linux compatibility, that argument is weaker than ever. Thousands of Windows games now run on Linux with little to no tweaking. Performance gaps have narrowed dramatically. Anti-cheat support, once a complete deal breaker, has improved, not perfectly, but significantly. And with more game engines building cross-platform pipelines by default, the technical barrier continues to shrink. Linux in 2026 may not dominate gaming, but it no longer feels excluded from it. Then there's software availability. For years, the lack of Adobe Creative Cloud and Microsoft Office native support was a critical blow. Professionals couldn't switch even if they wanted to. But cloud-first workflows have changed the landscape. Office 365 runs in the browser. Google Docs dominates collaboration. Figma, Canva, Notion, Slack, and countless other tools are web. The operating system matters less when the app lives in a browser, and browsers on Linux are first-class citizens. Now, Chrome, Firefox, Edge, Brave they run smoothly and reliably. But let's be honest, not everything is solved. Adobe still doesn't officially support Linux. Certain niche enterprise software remains when some hardware vendors still treat Linux as an afterthought, and fragmentation hasn't magically disappeared. There are still countless distributions, still multiple package formats, still debates about systems versus alternatives, but here's the difference. These problems are less visible to the average user. The friction has moved from impossible to occasionally inconvenient. One of Linux's historical weaknesses was perception. It was seen as a hobbyist system, something for developers and tinkerers. But 2026 has normalized Linux in subtle ways. The rise of developer culture, containerization, cloud infrastructure, and remote work has made Linux mainstream behind the scenes. Most servers run Linux, most cloud systems run Linux, Android is Linux-based, Chromebooks are Linux-based under the hood. Even Windows now integrates Linux deeply through WSL. The irony is powerful. Linux didn't conquer the desktop. It conquered everything else. And that shift has psychological consequences. When users realize that the backbone of the internet runs on Linux, the system no longer feels obscure. It feels credible. Stability becomes an expectation. Security becomes assumed. Updates feel less intrusive. Compare that to Windows' ongoing update frustrations or hardware requirement controversies. Every time Microsoft makes a controversial decision, Linux quietly gains attention. Not because Linux markets aggressively, but because users start looking for alternatives. Privacy is another area where Linux has strengthened its position. In an era of increasing telemetry, targeted ads, AI data scraping, and subscription-based ecosystems, Linux offers something refreshing: control, no forced accounts, no unavoidable ads in the start menu, no mandatory AI assistant pinned to your taskbar. For users who value autonomy, that matters. And in 2026, more users are paying attention to digital ownership than they were a decade ago. Hardware compatibility used to be a minefield. Printers were infamous, graphics drivers were unpredictable, laptops sometimes had broken function keys or power management issues. Today, many major hardware manufacturers provide official or semi-official Linux support. Intel and AMD. Graphics drivers are solid. NVIDIA's situation has improved. Many Wi-Fi chipsets work out of the box. Even fingerprint sensors and touchpads are better supported than before. It's not flawless, but it's dramatically better. The desktop environments themselves have GNOME feels polished and modern. Plasma has refined its customization without sacrificing stability. Even smaller environments have carved out niches for specific audiences. The visual gap between Linux and proprietary systems has closed. Animations are smooth, scaling works properly on high-resolution displays. Wayland, once experimental, has become the default in many distros, improving security and performance. Yet the biggest transformation might not be technical at all. It might be... In 2026, installing Linux is simpler than ever. User-friendly installers guide you through partitioning. Live USB environments allow full testing before committing. Documentation is clearer. YouTube tutorials are everywhere. AI chatbots, ironically, now help troubleshoot Linux problems in seconds. The intimidation factor has decreased significantly. Still, we have to ask the uncomfortable question: has Linux truly lost its biggest weakness, or has the market simply shifted around it? When so much software runs in browsers, does operating system compatibility matter less? When gaming engines target Vulkan and cross-platform APIs, is Linux benefiting from broader industry trends rather than solving its own issues? Perhaps Linux didn't eliminate its weaknesses entirely. Perhaps the world evolved in a direction that favors Linux's strengths. Consider subscription fatigue. Users are increasingly frustrated with software-as-a-service models. Linux, with its open-source ecosystem, offers alternatives that are free and community. LibreOffice may not replace Microsoft Office for everyone, but it satisfies many users. GIMP may not fully replace Photoshop, but it's more capable than ever. Blender, a Linux-friendly powerhouse, dominates in 3D creation. Open source tools have matured significantly. Another factor is performance efficiency. Modern Windows versions continue to grow heavier, demanding newer hardware. Linux distributions, on the other hand, often run comfortably on older systems. In a global economy where not everyone upgrades hardware every 2 years, this matters. Linux extends the life of machines. That's not just technical, it's economic and environmental. But we can't ignore the fragmentation question. Multiple package managers, multiple desktop paradigms, different update philosophies, rolling release versus fixed release. To enthusiasts, this is freedom. To newcomers, it can be confusing. The Linux community has made progress in simplifying experiences, but philosophical diversity remains part of its DNA. Whether that's a strength or a lingering weakness depends on perspective. Support is another area where Linux historically struggled. There was no official helpline, no single company responsible for everything. But in 2026, community forums, wikis, and real-time chat platforms are stronger than ever. Enterprise support exists through companies like Red Hat, Canonical, and others. For home users, peer support often resolves issues faster than traditional call centers. The decentralized model hasn't disappeared, it's just matured. So has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness? If that weakness was accessibility, the answer might be close to yes. If it was application compatibility, the answer is mostly. If it was gaming, the answer is surprisingly close. If it was perception, the answer is definitely shifting. But Linux hasn't transformed into Windows. it hasn't abandoned its philosophy. It still expects a bit more curiosity from its users. Maybe the real story isn't that Linux has become perfect. It's that the trade-offs have changed. The gap between effort and reward has narrowed. The benefits, privacy, performance, customization, control now outweigh the inconveniences for more people than ever before. Linux hasn't lost its identity. It has simply grown up. In 2026, choosing Linux no longer feels like making a statement. It feels like making a decision. And that difference is enormous. The operating system that once required bravery now requires consideration. The biggest weakness being not ready is fading into history. But the truth is nuanced. Linux still isn't for everyone. Creative professionals locked into proprietary ecosystems may hesitate. Certain enterprise environments still standardize around Windows. Some users simply prefer familiarity, and that's okay. The goal was never universal domination. It was viability. And viability in 2026 is undeniable. Linux has crossed a psychological threshold. It's no longer the underdog begging for attention. It's the quiet alternative that works. The system you install and forget about, the machine that updates without drama, the environment that respects your control. So has Linux finally lost its biggest weakness? Perhaps not entirely, but it has weakened it enough that millions no longer see it as a barrier. And sometimes, in technology, perception is the final obstacle. The truth about Linux in 2026 isn't that it replaced Windows. It's that it doesn't need to. It carved its own space. It matured quietly. It benefited from industry shifts. It refined its rough edges. And in doing so, it turned its biggest weakness into something far less intimidating. Linux didn't win by becoming something else. It won by staying consistent long enough for the world to catch up